Chapter 8. Nigeria and Challenges of Climate Change and Sustainable Development in Global Context. Modified edition of this chapter first appeared in two articles, namely A. Oyeshola, D. 2011, Human Security and Global Warming, Challenges Before Two Nigerian Dominant Religions, in Karianis, E. ed., Planet Earth 2011 Global Warming Challenges and Opportunities for Policy and Practice, in Tech, Rijeka, Croatia, pp. 623-646, and B. Oyeshola, D. 2009, UN Reform and the Role of the Security Council, The Imperative of Democratic Governance from an African Perspective, in Alexander, K. ed., Terrorism and Global Insecurity, A Multidisciplinary Perspective, Linton Atlantic Books, Yarnton, Oxon, UK, Cambridge, UK pp. 245-260. The first fundamental assumption of this chapter is that international system where world politics finds a home has come to stay and every country in the globe is an integral part. Therefore, finding solutions to the challenges of the world must necessarily be local, national, international and corporate in nature. Secondly, challenges of climate change and sustainable development in global context are central. Thirdly, the chapter is the core of this second edition. This chapter has 4 parts. The first part is an overview of the historical context of Europe as the architect of the contemporary international system, taken as its starting point the era of the Enlightenment. The character of international system and a synopsis of environmental degradation and its effect become the second part. The third is the theoretical framework of analysis that guides the exploration of the terrain of discourse. It is broadly captured under realist and idealist traditions, modernization, world system and liberal internationalism theories. The last part of this chapter discusses recommendations as a way forward in finding solutions to the challenges of sustainable development and climate change in global context from the point of view of Nigeria. The recommendations are discussed before the concluding remarks under I. Reconstruction of mindset of national interest ideology of nation-states. E. Can the strengthening of concerted effort of Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, BRICS, promote an alternative development pattern for developing countries? E. The imperative of reform of the UN from the perspective of inclusiveness of global citizens. IV. Commitment to the international rule of law. V. Renewal of international ethics morality. Vi. Good governance and development of the African countries with emphasis on Nigeria, and VII. Challenges of religious ideologies and environmental problematic. Strengthening concerted effort of BRICS as a recommendation is put forward because of the clarion call in some quarters to establish an alternate platform to the West-dominated paradigm of development that has been enshrined in the international system for so long. Here a discourse on this recommendation is undertaken to establish the credibility or otherwise of such a call. Relevant and salient information on climate change and sustainable development have already been captured in chapters 2, 4, 5 and 6. They stand as a prelude to this chapter. An overview of the immediate era preceding the international system. The ideals of the 18th century Enlightenment era manifest with the vision of the perfectibility of human beings through the power of reason, which laid the basis for the notion of egalitarianism at the heart of the French and American revolutions. The Enlightenment was a late 17th and 18th century intellectual movement emphasizing reason, individualism and skepticism. The Enlightenment challenged traditional religious views and employed the scientific method to understanding the world around it. It stood opposed, in varying degrees, to supernatural occurrences, superstition and intolerance. The writings of intellectuals, like René Descartes, Baruch Spinoza, and Isaac Newton were particularly important in giving birth to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment started in Europe and eventually spread to the United States, where it attracted followers like Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson. The Enlightenment died out in the early 19th century as Romanticism, a movement in literature and art during the late 18th and early 19th centuries which celebrated nature rather than civilization, gained appeal. The ideas in the Age of Enlightenment originated from the great powers of the age, England and France. The trends in natural science, philosophy, religion and politics spread over a large part of Europe and America and created many of the values of the time. The Age of Enlightenment was marked by intense and lively debate within the newly established middle class, where concepts such as the reasonable, the natural and the beneficial were often points of discussion. The desire to have a deeper understanding of the world led to many departures from the traditions and authority of former times. The age was influenced by these new and unconventional ways of thinking, which also led to discussions on the political and religious structure of society. The trends emanating from the great powers affected the individual countries in Europe in different ways. For instance, these trends affected Denmark in earnest in the mid-18th century. Questions on the way in which society and the state were organized and the part citizens should play in their relationship to state and monarch were fundamental issues during this period. Enlightenment thinkers in Britain, France and throughout Europe questioned traditional authority and embraced the notion that humanity could be improved through national change. The Enlightenment produced numerous books, essays, inventions, scientific discoveries, laws, wars, and revolutions. The American and French revolutions were directly inspired by Enlightenment ideals and respectively ultimately gave way to the 19th century Romanticism. While the Enlightenment was a broad movement, there are several core themes that were characteristics of it. One was reason. Enlightenment thinkers typically denounced supernatural occurrences as mere superstition. To a degree, the Enlightenment spurred atheism, but more commonly, it resulted in a mix between Christianity and scientific rationalism. Not all Enlightenment thinkers were atheists, in fact, most were not. This is best illustrated by the deist movement that gripped Europe and the United States during the late 18th century. Deism is the belief that God exists but chooses to let the universe proceed according to natural law. Deists deny supernatural occurrences and insist that God is knowable through reason and nature, not divine revelation. Going along with reason is another Enlightenment theme, which is skepticism of religious dogma, the institutionalized church, government authority, and even skepticism of the nature of reality. Enlightenment thinkers were skeptics. They typically rejected blind faith. They wanted proof, in the modern sense of the concept. This applied to all spheres of life, especially science and even the nature of reality itself. This is exemplified by René Descartes, who, in searching for proof of his own existence, famously said, "I think, therefore, I am." Individualism was another prominent theme of the Enlightenment. Human persons are endowed with certain liberties or rights. These rights were believed to have been granted by God and/or nature. Enlightenment figures typically chose ideas of equality and human dignity. The fact that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights is very much in line with the Enlightenment concept of individualism. Enlightenment thinkers, usually members of the upper class, were often sympathetic towards those in the lower class and supported their rights. Some of the key 17th century forefathers of the Enlightenment included the Englishman Francis Bacon and Thomas Hobbes, the Frenchman René Descartes, and the key natural philosophers of the scientific revolution, including Galileo, Kepler and Leibniz. Enlightenment roots are usually traced to 1680s England, where in the span of 3 years Isaac Newton published his Principia Mathematica in 1686 and John Locke his Essay Concerning Human Understanding in 1689. These two works provided the scientific, mathematical and philosophical toolkit for the Enlightenment's major advances. The High Enlightenment period of 1730–1780 centered on the dialogues and publications of the French philosophers, like Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu, Buffon and Diderot. The High Enlightenment might best be summed up by Voltaire's philosophical dictionary, a chaos of clear ideas. Foremost among these ideas was the notion that everything in the universe could be rationally clarified and catalogued. The signature publication of the period was Didierot's Encyclopédie, 1751–77, which brought together leading authors to produce an ambitious compilation of human knowledge. This period was also the age of enlightened despots, that is, cruel and authoritative dictators like Frederick the Great, who unified, rationalized and modernized Prussia in between brutal multi-year wars with Austria, and of enlightened would-be revolutionaries like Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson, whose Declaration of Independence, 1776, framed the American Revolution in terms taken from Locke's essays. It was also a time of religious and anti-religious innovations as Christians sought to reposition their faith along rational lines. Deists and materialists argued that the universe seemed to determine its own course without God's intervention. Secret societies, the Freemasons, the Bavarian Illuminati, the Rosicrucians flourished, offering European men, and a few women, new modes of fellowship, esoteric, hidden, ritual and mutual assistance. Coffee houses, newspapers and literary salons emerged as new venues for ideas to circulate. The third period of the late Enlightenment and beyond, 1780–1815, culminated in the French Revolution, a period of far-reaching social and political upheaval in France that lasted from 1789 until 1799 and was partially carried forward by Napoleon during the later expansion of the French Empire. The High Enlightenment vision of throwing out the old authorities to remake society along rational lines devolved into bloody terror that showed the limits of its own ideas and led, a decade later, to the rise of Napoleon. Still, its goal of egalitarianism attracted the admiration of the early feminists like Mary Wollstonecraft and inspired both the Haitian War of Independence and the radical racial inclusivism of Paraguay's first post-independence government. Enlightened rationality gave way to the wildness of Romanticism. The 19th century liberalism and classicism as well as the 20th century modernism owe a heavy debt to the thinkers of the Enlightenment. Reviewing the experience in 1784, Immanuel Kant saw emancipation from superstition and ignorance as having been the essential characteristic of the Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment was in vogue during the 18th century, but its watermark lingered on the world's most important documents. In fact, without it, the United States might not have been in existence as is known today. All these revolutions, scientific discoveries, break away from the Church, promoted new ideas and values concerning philosophical, economic and political debates. Growing skepticism in the absolute authority of both monarchy and church sowed the seeds for several revolutions that focused on individualism, freedom, self-determination and other agents of change. Democracy and equality were of great importance to the thinkers of the Enlightenment, who were dissatisfied with the mooching and prestige of the aristocratic social tier. The Age of Enlightenment influenced many legal codes and governmental structures that are still in place today. The idea for the three-branch system outlined in the U.S. Constitution, for example, was the brainchild of Charles Louis II, Baron de la Brede de Montesquieu. A major proponent of the Enlightenment, Montesquieu suggested the theory of the separation of powers to obtain a political system of checks and balances, promoting order and equality. Enlightened thinkers believed that when a people consent to be governed, it is with the implicit expectation that the government will act in the name of the common good. Failing that obligation means the people have the right to overthrow the government and install one that will successfully look out for the best interests. France is another country whose revolution was sparked by the fiery passions stirred up during the Age of Enlightenment. In 1789, the French revolted and issued a Declaration of Rights demanding liberty and equality among others. In fact, the upheaval of the Age of Enlightenment, and other nations' wars for independence from colonial rulers, such as those in South America, Africa, Asia, was soon to follow. The term civilization is another legacy of the Enlightenment. French and English 1770s dictionaries introduced the term with reference to the increase of wealth and the refinement of manners. Along with this understanding came another, namely that civilization could occur in degrees. With the existence of civilization established, Enlightenment thinkers were quick to claim that Europe, specifically the centers of Enlightenment thinking in France, Britain and Germany, were the most civilized places on the planet. The rest of the world was further down the scale of civilization, ranging from the underdevelopment that Western Europeans perceived in Eastern Europe to the barbarity that they saw in the Orient, and among the Amerindians. While such ideas of cultural superiority had existed for Europeans since the beginning of their imperial adventures in the 16th century, Enlightenment thinkers gave these ideas a clearer definition and one with a scientific veneer. Though ideals of civilization became and remained ideas to which European societies could aspire, they also provided a stronger philosophical underpinning for European empire building. This underpinning would prove critical in the 19th century as European powers, especially France and England, attempted to justify extending their control over the peoples of the entire world. European Western civilization became the yardstick to which other nations would measure civilization. So any other form of civilization is seen as barbaric. All these had a profound impact on the social and economic thinking of that time. This transformation led to the economic globalization of Europe and the world at large, leading to the emergence of the international system. Some characteristics of international system. In socio-political context, many significant structures arise because of a myriad of human interactions which they constitute and reinforce. At the same time, they serve to constrain and channel behavior and so prescribe the choice open to their actors. International system is similar as a structural framework in which its various constituent parts fit together as a unit, but dissimilar in the fact that the various units do not have a common goal in view. The organizing principle of the international system is anarchical as opposed to the municipal system one finds in the nation-state structure. This has a significant consequence for the second element of the structure of the system, which is the differentiation of the units. Whereas, in domestic societies, sociologists are mainly concerned with the ways in which the various units in the structure exhibit different characteristics and functions, no such differentiation occurs in the international system. The logic of anarchy and the absence of an ordered hierarchy mean that each unit must compete with its counterparts and fulfill equivalent functions, leading ineluctably to a situation in which they all resemble each other. The third defining element of the structure is the distribution of capacities across units. This is within the context of the constituents of national power of nation-states as listed by Morgenthau, 1967, 106 to 143, as geographical position, natural resources and technological endowments, industrial, military capability, and finally the intangibles of national morale and character and the quality of government and diplomacy. Contemporary international system is known to be an artificially originated system by states and is highly voluntaristic, that is, its members join it out of their own free will to constitute a system, and this is what is obtainable in United Nations, African Union, European Union, and so on. Furthermore, the international system is known to be highly decentralized. There is no central administrative, political or military authority in charge of the system. Although the United Nations comes close to an international authority, it has shortcomings. Its decisions, even those of the Security Council, can be ignored by states or thwarted by its members. For instance, China and Russia have continued to challenge the decision of the United Nations Security Council with regards to intervention in crisis-ridden states. This was seen in the case of Sudan, when China and Russia abstained from voting in favor of UN intervention and sanctions in Sudan during the Darfur conflict. In the crisis in Syria, China and Russia vetoed against United Nations US support for military intervention in Syria. There is no central authority in the system as each state becomes an authority on its own. A consequence of the decentralized nature of the international system is that both state and non-state actors are majorly guided by their perception of their self-interest in interactions with other units in the system. In the contemporary international system there is a rise in the number and types of states that constitute it. The great potential for destruction by those who possess weapons of mass destruction, increased vulnerability of states to external intrusions, including subversion, terrorism, economic pressures and military conquest, rising importance of non-state actors like multinationals, international interest groups and political parties transcending national frontiers, the increasing power of non-European states like Russia, China, emerging industrialized states, and the great degree of dependence and interdependence between and among all types of actors in international system can be identified. Cipala, 1965. Furthermore, it may be observed that international system is gradually moving towards a transparent world, especially through its promotion of democratic principles and good governance. Also, It is recognized that increasing philanthropic gestures of individuals are not only increasing but gradually moving away from their contributions being made at the end of their lives, as was the case in the distant past. Nowadays, individuals make wills to their beneficiaries and bequeath properties while they are alive, as opposed to after the death, to those persons or institutions they want. Fulfillment of corporate social responsibility of many organizations to their host communities, especially in many African countries, is becoming apparent. These organizations contribute to the promotion of sport, education and so on by way of giving scholarship and building of infrastructure and capacity building of citizens. At the moment, the exercise of corporate social responsibility is voluntary and generally at the detriment of the host community. Therefore, there is a need to institutionalize the principle of corporate social responsibility by formulating binding and enforceable laws on such multinationals. The state and host community will handsomely benefit. Lastly, human creativity is leading to good life in spite of bad use of technology. Arguably, these emerging tendencies are reinforcing the search for solutions that challenges climate change and sustainable development pose to international community. Contextualizing environmental discourse in relation to the environmental challenges, the following may shed light to the context of the discourse. The US and the Soviet Union fought together as allies against the Axis powers during the Second World War. That notwithstanding, the relationship between the two emergent superpowers after the war was a tense one. The Americans had long been wary of Soviet communism and concerned about the perceived Russian leadership's tyrannical rule of the country. They saw communism as a slave state that controls the private life and thoughts of its citizens. Also, it was considered as a threat that violated both democratic rights and civil liberties of its citizens, and therefore required the continued efforts of America to make sure that communism did not spread to the United States and other countries that have not moved politically towards Soviet Union. For their part, the Soviets resented the America's decades-long refusal to treat the USSR as a legitimate part of the international community. After the end of the Second World War, these grievances ripened into an overwhelming sense of mutual distrust. Post-war Soviet expansionism in Eastern Europe fueled many America's fears of a Russian plan to control the world. Meanwhile, the USSR came to resent what it perceived as American official confrontational rhetoric, arms build-up and interventionist approach in international relations. Nonetheless, at the close of the Second World War, security and peace still dominated international discourse, but with an emphasis on concern on the promotion of human rights. However, with the demise of Soviet Union in 1986 and the fall of Berlin Wall in 1996, new serious, interconnected but threatening global problems emerged. One of them is environmental threats. In order to confront environmental threats over the last few decades, the United Nations, the one body with the broad mandate, has forged ahead to finding solutions to the problems, with an impart extending beyond national boundaries. As early as the 1870s, countries occasionally sought to cooperate on issues such as protecting migratory bird species. But it was not until a century later that international environmental policy making began to gather serious momentum. In particular, the 1972 UN Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm marked the arrival of this subject as an international issue. Most notably, the conference created the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, which has its headquarters in Nairobi and serves as the main focal point for environmental issues within the UN system. French, 2011. The aftermath of the Second World War, the rise of the nuclear age, along with advancements in space travel and technology, provided a new motivation for environmental protection. Thus, on December 15, 1972, the UN General Assembly adopted Resolution 2997, in which it formed the United Nations Environmental Programme, UNEP, Governing Council, the UNEP Secretariat, and a voluntary environment fund, with the intention to provide leadership and encourage partnership in caring for the environment. Winan and Goal, 2017. This was followed by the 1992 Rio Earth Summit and the promotion of environmental sustainability within the context of the Millennium Development Goals 2000, and the Sustainable Development Goals 2015, UNEP, 2015. The second global challenge is terrorism. Concern for peace, security, promotion and maintenance of human rights provisions and sustainable development as an immediate response to the challenges of climate change and terrorism led the great powers to tailor their foreign policy orientation between two broad policy approaches, namely realism and idealism. The two theories are discussed below. Today, the socio-economic, political and cultural reality of the contemporary world is tough, aggressive and more complicated than before. The two broad dominant theoretical frameworks of realism and idealism of decades past are still at work today, their shortcomings notwithstanding. However, they now operate in tandem but open to other paradigms such as modernization, world system, liberal internationalism theories. Modernization theory is distinguishable by three main characteristics. A. It focuses on the nation-state as the only unit of analysis. B. It assumes that there is only a single path of evolutionary development for all countries. And C. It disregards transnational structures that constrain local and national development. World system theory refers to the national, interregional and transnational division of labor which divides the world into core, semi-periphery and periphery countries. Core countries focus on higher skill, capital-intensive production while the rest of the world focuses on low-skill, labor-intensive production and extraction of raw materials. This unwritten arrangement constantly reinforces the dominance of the core countries. The system has dynamic characteristics as a result of revolution in transport technology, and individual states can gain or lose their core or semi-periphery or periphery status over time. Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, the BRICS, are a case in point. Their status has moved from developing to emerging economy. For a time, certain countries become the world hegemon as the world system extended geographically and intensify economically. For instance, the status passed from the Netherlands to the United Kingdom and the United States of America. World system theory is an offshoot of modernization theory. Liberal internationalism, another theory, is often associated with former U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. Hoffman, 1995, 159. Wilson suggested that the cause of instability and conflict was the undemocratic nature of international politics, particularly in regard to foreign policy and the balance of power. Bayliss al. 2008, 111. This idea appeared to have been influenced by Immanuel Kant's Perpetual Peace, Steens and Pettiford, 2001, 45. Accordingly, it may be suggested that the aim of liberal internationalism is to expand democratic practice and free trade, defending democracy from its rivals while protecting and promoting human rights. Hoffman, 1995, 159. Combating human rights violations may be achieved using various international institutions which have liberal internationalist ideals embedded in their international constitutions. The UN and European Court of Human Rights (ECHR) are examples. Goldstein al. 2000. Such institutions give citizens the opportunity to stand up to what Marxists might term the ruling class. Liberal internationalism can be an approach to international relations aiming to spread liberal democracy throughout the world in order to bring an end to conflicts. Primarily because of human activities, the ecological makeup and harmonious relationships among the environmental constituent beings have been degraded and altered, leading to climate change and human insecurity. The effect of climate change leads to an immense social cost. Oyeshola, 1995, 1998, Adiner al. 2001. For instance, Hurricane Gilbert in 1988 caused damage estimated at over $870 million United States dollars in Jamaica. Foley, 1991, 47. Recent hurricanes like Katrina, Matthew, Harvey and Irma, earthquakes like that of Mexico, landslides, tsunami, floods and fires are testimonies to the dynamic, overwhelming, destructive capacity associated with climate change that makes it a different global, socio-economic, developmental and security problem. Unlike other problems like warfare, refuges and poverty, which may be localized and whose solutions may be delayed, climate change is a problem that involves every nation and the solution to it cannot be delayed. Any delay in addressing the problem promptly and radically too may mean that the entire humanity may perish sooner than later. This is a deadly serious implication for humanity in general and Nigeria in particular. Climate change is a serious issue. It is about life and death not only of individuals but of the planet that inhabits the global community. Reasons for this are not far-fetched. Likely effects of climate change include a more frequent occurrence of extreme weather events including heat waves, droughts and heavy rainfall, ocean acidification and species extinctions due to shifting temperature regimes. Adesina and Adekunle, 2011. Effect significant to humans includes the threat to food security from decreasing crop yields and the loss of habitat from inundation. Wikipedia, accessed 25 July 2013. Warming temperatures are already causing significant changes to mountain glaciers around the world, ice sheets in Greenland and the Antarctica, and polar sea ice in the Arctic from Europe through Asia to North America. Mountain glaciers have receded over the 20th century, and melting of ice may accelerate the pace of global warming in what is known as a feedback process. This is because as the ice reflects sunlight back out to space, it causes cooling effect, and the decrease or disappearance of ice will symbiotically contribute to temperate increase. Water and land, which are darker than ice, absorb and retain more heat. The Kilimanjaro mountain in Kenya, the highest peak in Africa, has lost more than 3/4 of its ice since 1912 and is estimated to be gone completely by 2020. Glaciers in the lofty Himalayas of Asia are melting at a rate of 9 to 15 meters per year. Annual runoff from these glaciers feeds major rivers such as the Ganges, Yangtze, and Mekong. The area covered by sea ice during summer has declined by 15 to 20% in the last 40 years and is projected to disappear almost completely in the late 21st century. Many such as polar bears, seals and walrus, depend on sea ice for survival. The rapid loss of ice in glaciers worldwide makes a significant contribution to observed sea level rise. Melting of Greenland ice sheets, which could raise sea level by 7 meters, 23 feet, if is melted completely, is also accelerating. The area that is experiencing at least some melting increased by 16% from 1979 to 2002, and scientists estimate that warming of more than a few degrees Celsius could widespread a possibly unstoppable melting, leading to significant sea level rise in 2019. Fresh water flowing from melting Arctic ice into the North Atlantic Ocean could disrupt ocean circulation patterns, which have significant influence on global climate. According to scientists' projections, a collapse of ocean circulation pattern is unlikely to occur by 2100. However, scientists do expect there could be a weakening and slowing of thermoline circulation that is also known as the ocean conveyor belt. In addition, a disruption of surface circulation pattern in North Atlantic, known collectively as the Gulf Stream, could lead to cooling in Europe. In Antarctica the situation is somehow different from that of the Arctic. The Antarctica Peninsula, the tail of land reaching towards South America, has experienced dramatic warming at a rate several times the average over the past 50 years. However, other parts of Antarctica have not shown similar trends, with some areas warming and some areas cooling. Overall, Antarctica is estimated to be warming at about the global average rate. Unlike the Arctic, there has been clear trend in sea ice. In the Antarctica Peninsula, however, 10 floating ice shelves have lost more than 14,000 square kilometers, 5,400 square ml, of ice, and probably have not been at such a low level in the past 10,000 years. As in Greenland, scientists estimate that warming of more than a few degrees Celsius could lead to widespread melting of the West Antarctica ice sheets. This melting alone would raise sea level by as much as 5 meters, 16 feet. Many of the seas and oceans have been seriously degraded in recent decades. McDonough, 1999, 86. These oceans contain not only most of the planet's water but also a very diverse range of living organisms. About 300,000 marine species have been identified, but it is commonly held by marine scientists that there is at least double that amount of species. It will be tragic to think that much of this marine life may be destroyed long before some of them are even identified. Human activities have led to other manifestations of environmental degradation, creating pollution of various types: waste, toxic, industrial, domestic, solid, acid rain, desertification, deforestation, ozone layer depletion and erosion. Oyeshola, 1995, 13, 1998, 51. Adinarela, 2001. Other impacts will include increased and more widespread viral incidences, diseases, outbreaks such as yellow fever, dengue, malaria, and natural disasters. Cold winter weather reduces the spread of infectious diseases by killing infectious organisms and carrier species, such as mosquitoes. Warmer, wetter weather, on the other hand, could increase the spread of malaria, dengue fever, and yellow fever. The possible increase in flooding and damage to water and sewage infrastructure can further encourage the spread of disease. Rising sea level requires many different local responses. For instance, urban areas on the U.S. coastline could be surrounded by rising sea water. Cities may require extensive infrastructure development to assure fresh water supplies, secure transportation, and protect people from flooding and storm surge. Sea walls can be built to protect cities and roads from rising seas. More robust building construction may also be required to withstand the increasingly intense storms that are likely to result from global warming. Fresh water supply is a concern as sea water penetrates groundwater aquifers, which become brackish and less usable further inland. At the end of the day, the cost of fight back of sea level rise due to global warming will be usually huge, as the experience of Nigeria in respect of the Bar Beach reclaim of land in Lagos demonstrated. The low-lying lands and heavily populated agricultural zones are vulnerable to rising sea levels. Nigeria cannot be indifferent to the effect of climate change, as especially and effectively predicted by the 1988 Toronto Conference. Succinctly, these possible effects of climate change are I. Imperial human health and welfare, diminish global food security, through increased soil erosion and greater shifts and uncertainties in agricultural production, particularly for many vulnerable regions, change the distribution and seasonal availability of fresh water resources, IV. Increased political instability and the potential for international conflict, V. Jeopardize prospects for sustainable development and reduction of poverty, Vi. Accelerate extinction of animal and plant species upon which human survival depends, and VII. Alter yield, productivity and biological diversity of natural and managed ecosystems, particularly forests. Already, Nigeria has experienced coastal land sea water rise, leading to serious fight of Fashola administration of Lagos state to keep the sea in check by variety of strategies like sand filling and making concrete barriers across the beaches, among others. Weather is becoming unpredictable, making farming problematic. Already farming produce is not as buoyant as one would have wished to see. Besides, heat has become a common source of complaint by many citizens, even if the country is situated in the tropics, because the weather is becoming unusually hotter. Consequently, Nigeria cannot but team up with international community to seek for solutions for global warming. Anything less may threaten the existence of the country and its people if the current trend of climate change continues. Africa's annual gross domestic product (GDP) loss would be between 1.5 to 3% by 2030. Besides, famine and wars are expected to rise, and the Niger Delta region could be submerged. There were predictions about Lagos being submerged in flood. Coastal communities like Ayatoro in a large local government area of Ondo State already lost more than half of its land to the ocean. Similarly, in the northeast of the country, the effect of climate change is no longer a stranger. The rain pattern in the northeast has changed. We can't predict the quantum and distribution. Food security is affected, and that has, apart from the one caused by insurgency, we have climate refuges in the north and the south. The then permanent secretary in the Environment Ministry, Bakar Hassan. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change also predicted that about 250 million Africans will be exposed to increased water stress by 2020, and affirmed that Lake Chad, with an estimated area of 26,000 square kilometers, has reduced to just about 10% of its size of 1960. Lake Chad is typical of water masses that are drying up because of global warming, and fresh water is not easily available, as was the case some decades ago due to the drying up of sources of springs in some highlands. Lake Chad is economic lifeline to more than 30 million people in Nigeria, Cameroon, Chad and Niger. In a report titled, "Turn the Heat Down," released in 2013, the World Bank predicted that dry and arid regions in southern and western Africa will increase by 10% by 2030, and if the global temperature increases from 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius by 2040, African farmers will lose between 40 to 80% of their crop land, while yields from rain-fed agriculture will suffer reduction by at least 50% by 2020. This will adversely affect food security, fueling climate change, unrest and violence. The complex ecosystem may take centuries to form, but it can be destroyed by human mismanagement in just a few years. If this happens, the ecosystem that supports the Earth will collapse and humanity will perish in the process. This is a devastating implication and a possible reality. It is in the light of the realization of this that sustainable development paradigm shift and search for low-carbon society have become an integral part of global environmental politics. One of the simple ways to understand sustainable development is to know its principles and implications. Sustainable development principles and their implication. The conceptual term, sustainable development, was popularized by the World Commission on the Environment and Development, WCED, in 1987 in connection with the use of environmental resources. The concept may be defined simply as the general principle that human development and use of natural resources must take place in a sustainable manner. Sands, 1995, 198. At the international level, the 1987 Brundtland Report of the World Commission on Environment and Development, WCED, widely accepted as a precursor to the 1992 UN Conference on Environment and Development, UNCED, in Rio de Janeiro, defined sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. There are at least four main principles in respect of sustainable development. The first principle is the exploitation of natural resources in a manner that is sustainable, or prudent, the principle of sustainable use. The second is that of equitable use of natural resources, which implies that the use by one state must take account of the needs of other states, the principle of equitable use, or intragenerational equity. The third principle is the integration of environmental considerations into economic and other development plans, programs and projects, the principle of integration of environment and development needs. Sands, 1995, 199. The last is the conservation of natural resources for the benefit of future generations, the principle of intergenerational equity. All these principles, later in 2002, in Johannesburg, South Africa, became the articles of the conference. The implication of these principles must necessarily establish a synergy among sustainable development principles, human security and enforcement of environmental law principles if the applications of the principles will produce the desired result of human security. What is human security? After the end of World War XI, proponents of the classical tradition of international relations saw security narrowly as national security, that is, the protection or preservation of the state's territorial integrity and external sovereignty. For them, security denotes the absence of a military threat, which generally means the protection of a state from external military attack. Makanda, 1996, 152, but Willy Brandt understands security more broadly as an important task of constructive international policy that will have to consist in providing a new, more comprehensive understanding of security, which would be less restricted to the purely military aspects. In the global context, true security cannot be achieved by a mounting up of weapons defense in the narrow sense, but only by providing basic conditions for peaceful relations between nations, and solving not only the military but also the non-military problems which threaten them. Brandt, 1980, 214. Similarly, The Palm Commission and its subsequent reports of 1982 and 1989 argued that the abolition or large reduction in weapons of mass destruction and conventional disarmament are prerequisites to providing momentum for progress on economic and social development and environmental conservation. The Palm Commission, 1989. Furthermore, Gro Harlem Brundtland in Our Common Future was more explicit about the inadequacy of security defined narrowly in military terms. She demonstrated the tension between security understood primarily in military terms and environmental security. She equally criticized global militarism and the vested interests that profited from it and called on nations to turn away from the destructive logic of an arms culture. World Commission on Environment and Development, 1987, 297-304. All the above definitions and descriptions are security of nations and their relationships centered. So if one thinks of security only in terms of nation-states, one risks confining analysis of security to a threat to the survival of the state, war and conquest. Therefore, the concept of security can be expanded to include natural forces that threaten security. Some of these are earthquakes, hurricanes, volcanoes, floods, mudslides, forest fires and climate change. Human agencies that can threaten security include terrorists, criminals, lunatics, organized crime, civil war, insurgency and conflict of authority. From the perspective of feminists, security must be defined in multidimensional terms which include freedom from both physical and structural violence. This perspective is further reflected in the National Organization for Women, NOW, which in its 1990 resolution on women in combat affirmed that 80 to 90% of casualties due to conflict since the Second World War have been civilians, the majority of them women and children. The strategy of rape in the war in Bosnia has alerted the world to an atrocity that has always existed in wartime, although it is usually unreported. Women and children constitute 80% of the global refugee population, a phenomenon usually attributed to military conflict. Women are also the most frequent victims of domestic violence in all societies, a crime which is always underreported, but one which ranges across regions, cultures and classes. United Nations, 1991. Violence against women is higher in militarized societies and in military families. Evidence such as this suggests that women are particularly vulnerable to militarism and war. Booth and Smith, 1995, 191. Extending the definition of security to economic and environmental dimensions also highlights vulnerabilities of women, as a 1981 report on the UN Committee on the States of Women claimed while women represent half the global population and 1/3 of the paid labor force and are responsible for 2/3 of all working hours, they receive only 1/10 of world income and own less than 1% of world property. United Nations, 1991. 81-114 citing Jagger, 1983, 138. Within the structural adjustment policies in the Global South, women have been impacted heavily upon. They have to assume additional caregiving tasks when states are forced to cut back on social spending. Women are also particularly vulnerable to environmental degradation, especially in rural areas of Africa and Asia where women walk up to 10 kilometers a day to search for shrinking supplies of fuel, wood and water. Women's reproductive systems are particularly susceptible to the hazards of toxic wastes and industrial pollution and accidents. Oyeshola, 1995, 211, Booth and Smith, 1995, 192. The reality of the outlined descriptions of security above has not fundamentally changed. In the post-colony era of many African countries, particularly Nigeria, the term security carries with it a nuance which is worth noting. This can be described as security not only as control over territories and subjugated peoples, but also as a mode of masculinity. In patriarchal societies, masculine conceptions of security require control over women. In military states this translates into command over women, which involves the formal or informal appointment of a commander of women, who is recognized by the military hierarchy, and who is arrogated the right to articulate and address the concerns of women. It is from the above background of understanding security that the Earth Summit of Rio in 1992 was coming. At the Earth Summit, one of the fundamental emerging principles in its declarations was that of Principle 1, which stipulated that human person is at the heart of socio-political activities and that it is no longer economic growth per se as was the situation before. Women are also human beings. This new orientation has necessitated a paradigm shift in respect of the concept of security. Flowing from this, the United Nations Development Programme (UNDP) 1994 Human Development Report argued that security should be expanded to include threats in 7 areas, namely, economic, food, health, environment, personal, community and political. These areas together are now referred to as human security. This is described below. Economic security requires an assured basic income for individuals, usually from productive and remunerative work or, as a last resort, from a publicly financed safety net. In this sense, only about a quarter of the world's people are presently economically secure. Food security, which is closely related to economic security, requires that all people at all times have both physical and economic access to basic food. According to the United Nations, the overall availability of food is not a problem, rather the problem often is the poor distribution of food and a lack of purchasing power. In the past, food security problems have been dealt with at both national and global levels. However, their impacts are limited. According to UN, the key to finding solution is to tackle the problems that are related to access to assets, work and assured income. Health security aims to guarantee a minimum protection from diseases and unhealthy lifestyles. In developing countries, the major causes of death traditionally are infectious and parasitic diseases, whereas in industrialized countries, the major killers are diseases of the circulatory system. Today, lifestyle-related chronic diseases are leading killers worldwide, with 80% of deaths from chronic diseases occurring in low and middle-income countries. According to the United Nations, in both developing and industrial countries, threats to health security are usually greater for poor people in rural areas, particularly children. This is due to malnutrition and insufficient access to health services, clean water and other necessities. Environmental security aims to protect people from the short and long-term ravages of nature, human-made threats in nature, and deterioration of the natural environment. In developing countries, lack of access to clean water resources is one of the greatest environmental threats. In industrial countries, one of the major threats is air pollution. Global warming, caused by the emission of greenhouse gases, is another environmental security issue. Personal security aims to protect people from physical violence, whether from the state or external states, from violent individuals and sub-state actors, from domestic abuse, or from predatory adults. For many people, the greatest source of anxiety is crime, particularly violent crime. Community security aims to protect people from the loss of traditional relationships and values and from sectarian and ethnic violence. Traditional communities, particularly minority ethnic groups, are often threatened. About half of the world's states have experienced some inter-ethnic strife. The United Nations declared 1993 the Year of Indigenous People to highlight the continuing vulnerability of the 300 million Aboriginal people in 70 countries as they face a widening spiral of violence. Political security is concerned with whether people live in a society that honors the basic human rights. According to a survey conducted by Amnesty International, political repression, systematic torture, ill treatment or disappearance was still practiced in 110 countries. Human rights violations are most frequent during periods of political unrest. Along with repressing individuals and groups, governments may try to exercise control over ideas and information. In summary, human security must necessarily embrace all the facets surrounding the human person, including religion, human rights and all aspects of challenges of human well-being like terrorism. Theoretical framework of analysis. Some of the theories that are employed under the theoretical frame of analysis for this chapter are discussed in the following paragraphs. Idealism. Idealists argue that what ultimately shapes world politics are moral ideals and values like freedom, dignity, justice, free trade, equity, says who, and so on. These values were formerly rooted in Judeo-Christian tradition that believes in God and that human beings are made in His image. Those beliefs give them meaning and basis of commitment. In the world of today, the values are essentially cut off from their root. They are independent and arbitrary, hence they are not worth dying for as before. The idealists further argue that peace, prosperity, respect for human rights, self-determination of peoples, and the right to democratic election of a country's own government are the values that drive the international system. It is the same orientation they affirm that is considered to be at the heart of the UN system, an institutional symbol of international cooperative effort to live in peace and solidarity. Realist theory. Realism, on the other hand, views international politics primarily from its competitive and conflict angles, setting as primary national interest of nation-states. It is usually contrasted with idealism or liberalism, which tends to emphasize cooperation. Realism emphasizes the constraints on politics imposed by human nature and the absence of international government. For the realists, anarchical characteristics, the absence of a central authority, lack of common morality and culture, and national interest ideology, define the international system. Donnelly, 2000. The realists consider human nature to be corrupt. For them, human nature and anarchy make international relations largely a realm where power and national self-interest are rigorously pursued. Struggle for power is characterized by a concern with material coercive power. Power is primarily viewed in military terms, and the military power of other states presents the greatest potential danger to an individual state. Slaughter, 2011, since realism treats states as the primary unit of analysis. Classical realists like Edward Carr and Hans Morgenthau sought to explain the nature of international politics by these fundamentals. Morgenthau expressed that a politics is governed by objective laws that have their roots in human nature. B. The main signpost that helps political realism to find its way through the landscape of international politics is the concept of interest defined in terms of power. C. Power and interest are variable in content. D. Universal moral principles cannot be applied to the actions of states. E. Political realism refuses to identify the moral aspirations of a nation with the moral laws that govern the universe. And F. The autonomy of the political sphere. Morgenthau, 1954. 4-10. Since states are sovereign and thus autonomous of each other, no inherent structure or society can emerge or even exist to order relations between them. They are bound only by forcible coercion or their own consent. In such an anarchic system, state power is the key and the only variable of interests, because only through power can states defend themselves and hope to survive. This does not mean war. There can be peace, but a durable peace is based upon a stable balance of power. This is when strongest states in the international system are roughly equal in power resources and none will think that it can win a war. After all states are considered to be rational actors and none will start one, so goes the reasoning with the realists. Realists consider the principal actor in the international arena to be states which are concerned with their own security, act in pursuit of their own national interests and struggle for power. The negative side of the realists' emphasis on power and self-interest is often their skepticism regarding the relevance of ethical norms to relations among states. National politics is the realm of authority and law, whereas international politics, they sometimes claim, is a sphere without justice characterized by active or potential conflict among states. Not all realists, however, deny the presence of ethics in international relations. The distinction could be drawn between classical realism represented by such 20th-century theorists as Reinhold Niebuhr and Hans Morgenthau and radical or extreme realism. While classical realism emphasizes the concept of national interest, it is not the Machiavellian doctrine that anything is justified by reason of state, Bull 1995, 189. Nor does it involve the glorification of war or conflict. Classical realists do not reject the possibility of moral judgment in international politics. Rather, they are critical of moralism, abstract moral discourse, that does not consider political realities. They assign supreme value to successful political action based on prudence, the ability to judge the rightness of a given action from among possible alternatives based on its likely political consequences. Realism is the predominant school of thought in international relations theories, theoretically formalizing the politics of statesmanship of early modern Europe. Although a highly diverse body of thought, it can be thought of as unified by the belief that world politics is, in the final analysis, always, and necessarily a field of conflict among actors pursuing power. Crudely, realists are of three kinds in what they take as the source of conflict that is eliminable. Classical realists believe that it follows from human nature. Neo-realists focus upon the structure of the anarchic state system, and neoclassical realists believe that it is a result of a combination of the two and certain domestic variables. Realists also disagree about what kind of action states ought to take to navigate world politics, dividing between, although most realists fall outside the two groups, defensive realism and offensive realism. Although the realist school of thought has several strands, all realist arguments are based on the assumptions that a. The international realm is anarchic and consists of independent political units called states. b. States are the primary actors and inherently possess some offensive military capability or power which makes them potentially dangerous to each other. c. Survival or maintenance of sovereignty is the principal goal of every state. d. States are rational actors and think strategically about how to survive. Beavis, 2017. A critique of realism can be centered on a. Realism, in emphasizing the principle of power politics and the enduring features of the international system, fails to allow for the possibility of real change. b. In failing to embrace the idea of substantive changes, realism is inherently conservative and anti-innovative, meaning that it is highly attractive to those who would have things continue as they are. c. Whether intentionally or not, realism may also serve to justify injustice on the grounds that nothing can be done to change things. d. By considering states to be the only important type of actor in international relations, realists have been criticized for not being able to fully account for a range of issues and processes in international relations, and e. Realism ignores or significantly downplays the degree to which states might have collective or mutual interests, and so underestimates the scope for cooperation and purposive change in international relations. Steens, Pettiford, Diaz, and L. Annis, 2010. Institutionalism shares many of realism's assumptions about the international system that a. It is anarchic, b. States are self-interested, rational actors seeking to survive while increasing their material conditions, and c. Uncertainty pervades relations between countries. However, institutionalism reaches a radically different conclusion. For it, cooperation between nations is possible, while realists doubt such cooperation can be sustained in the absence of coercive power. The central insight is that cooperation may be a rational, self-interested strategy for countries to pursue under certain conditions. Institutionalists, in contrast, argue that institutions defined as a set of rules, norms, practices and decision-making procedures that shape expectations can overcome the uncertainty that undermines cooperation. Slaughter, 2011. Thank you for visiting this channel, Environmental Tonic by Professor Dokun Oyeshola O.P. For continuation of Chapter 8 of the video book, Sustainable Development, Issues and Challenges for Nigeria, visit Amazon Publication or get a copy of the textbook. Thank you.